you for joining the third week in the Foundation of Economic Thought seminar hosted by the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets at the University of Pennsylvania. As always, the session will last 90 minutes. The lecture runs for approximately 60 to 75 minutes, followed by a session of questions and answers. Feel free to submit the questions at any time using Zoom's Q&A function. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Ivan Luzardo. He's a fellow here at the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets, and he will lecture on marginal economics, the beginning of the marginalism in economics, and Alfred Marshall. So thank you, Ivan.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for the opportunity. So let me share my screen in order you can see my presentation. So could you please confirm if you can see my...
We can.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much again. So the idea for today is to explore the ideas that Alfred Marshall had about economics, and also explore the marginal revolution. So as you can see, we can connect Alfred Marshall with the marginalist revolution, but at the same time, we can think in them as two different episodes or two different two different things in the history of economic thought. We will see the difference through how the lecture, but basically one of the conclusions, one of the takeaways from this lecture is that Alfred Marshall formalized a lot of the ideas that originally came from the marginal revolution. So you can see in the marginal revolution like something more descriptive, more qualitative, more philosophical until a certain extent. So basically, with Marshall, you will see the professionalization of economics as a field or as a discipline different from a philosophy or political science. So you can think in Alfred Marshall like the father of the economists of the professionalization of economy. So usually we call Adam Smith like the father of the economy, but with Marshall, we will see at the development of a kind of economics that is very similar to what we have today. So I organized my presentation in three the different sessions. So the first one is the historical context. So I think that is very important, the historical context, in order to understand both Marshall and the marginalists. So the historical context is essentially the second half of the 19th century. So we can think in the United Kingdom, but in general terms in Western Europe, in the second half of the 19th century. And basically, what we are seeing is the improvement in the standard of living. So basically, we see that all those predictions from Marx and all that idea that a consequence of industrialization would be the deterioration or the worsening in the standard of living. So basically, all those prophecies didn't fulfill. So basically, what we see in the second half of the 19th century, on the contrary, is an improvement in the standard of living. And one of those indicators that is essential to understand the standard of living in one country or in one economy is life expectancy. So life expectancy, you can see that it was essentially stagnant in the first half of the 19th century, and approximately the second half of the 19th century, or more specifically in the 1870s, you can see a persistent improvement. And by the end of the 19th century, so it's evident that the cohorts that were born at that time, so they were living longer than the people and the cohorts that were born at the beginning of the 19th century. So this first indicator is showing us that there is an important improvement in the standard of living. So we have talked here about the Industrial Revolution, so how you have a persistent increase in the income per capita after industrialization, but by the first half of the 19th century, it's not evident that that growth, that economic growth, is translate in an improvement in the standard of living. So we can see that you have two different phenomena. So one thing is economic growth that began, that started with industrialization, and the other thing is economic development or the standard of living that started a little bit later. We can think, broadly speaking, that the actual improvement in many of the indicators of the standard of living started in the second half of the 19th century. So this is basically what this figure is showing us. Another way to indirectly measure the standard of living in a population is by the average height. So you can think that height is associated with indicators like nutrition or sanitation, other conditions that are important for the standard of living. If you have a worsening, for instance, in sanitation, or if you have a worsening in terms of nutrition, so probably you will observe you will observe a lower average height in a population. On the contrary, if you have an improvement in terms of nutrition, in terms of sanitation, so we will observe improvement, a growth in terms of the average height. So you can see the evolution of the average height of men throughout the 19th century. And what you can see here is an initial deterioration between 1810 and approximately 1815. And then in that minimum point, so you can start to see an improvement that was persistent. So we can again associate that deterioration with the initial stage of industrialization. So after industrialization, again, so you have an increase in the income per capita, but that doesn't mean that the quality of life or the standard of living is improvement in the population. So basically, on the contrary, what you see is all the description that we mentioned it last week about the how urbanization is growing in Britain. But you see that all those people that is coming from the countryside, so they are living in very poor conditions. So there is a substantial deterioration in sanitation. You can see an increase on infectious disease, and probably all that is behind that deterioration in the average height. After that lowest point, we can call that like the nadir, like the minimum point in the 19th century, we will start to see a persistent improvement again. So probably this is correlated with nutrition, this is correlated with sanitary conditions. In that historical context is that we will see the development of the marginal revolution and the rise and the consolidation of those ideas. This is just a reference if you are interested in this topic of height and quantify the standard of living. So I strongly recommend you this book by Robert Fogel, very important in economic history, and is probably a good introduction to the discussion about how was the transition from starvation or from what we call the Malthusian trap towards a modern economy characterized by a constant increase in life expectancy in indicators, for instance, like nutrition. All other indicators related with quality of life. So we mentioned that one of the reasons why we have that initial decline, I mean, in the early stage of industrialization, was the accelerated process of urbanization. So population is growing very fast during the 19th century in Britain. But it's not only that population is growing, it's also that population is increasingly concentrated in big cities. So we can we call currently those places like big cities, but at the beginning of the 19th century they were mainly like middle size or even small towns. So you can see so how total population, I think this is the population only for England and Wales, increased from around 9 millions by the beginning of the 19th century, and how that population reached in over 36 million in the early 20th century. At the same time, you can see that that population is increasingly concentrated in cities. So you can see that by the beginning of the 19th century, Britain was essentially a rural country. So the most of the population lived in the countryside. But at the end of the century, that country is completely different in terms of where population is living. So you can see that by the late 19th century, for instance, in 1881, Britain is essentially a urban country. So you can see that the condition is different, and of course all that will have an impact in terms of consumption, in terms of the demand for different commodities, and in that historical context we will see the development of the marginal reproduction. This is just another table that is essentially is showing us how accelerated is the population growth in England relative to other European countries. And you can see that there is a strong connection in terms of economic growth and population growth. Other country that also is experiencing an accelerated economic growth during the 19th century, of course, is Germany. And you can see how accelerated the population growth in Germany is. But England is by far the country with the highest population growth. So basically, we can conclude that a lot of the many of one substantial part of the benefits from industrialization translated in an increase in population. So basically, they didn't go necessarily to increase the income per capita, but they went to increase how much an economy, how large the population can be in an economy without a deterioration in the income per capita. As we mentioned before, that population is concentrated essentially in urban areas. This is just an illustration of Manchester during the first half of the 19th century. This is Manchester in 1844, and you can see that is essentially we are talking about middle size or a small town. So probably that version of Manchester is not very different from the medieval version. So the city is not as large as will be during at the end of the 19th century. And this is a picture of Manchester in the early 20th century. So you can see that the contrast between these two versions of Manchester is very high. And again, this is evidence of how transformative were the second were those the case in the second half of the 19th century. So you can see in Manchester in the early 20th century like a city that is not very different from the current version of Manchester. So you can see, for instance, electricity. So the infrastructure is probably very familiar to us, but this version of Manchester is completely different. So basically, this is an evidence that you are having England is experiencing an important transformation as Manchester, other cities across the UK are also experiencing an accelerated transformation. So this is just some of the I mean, some insights that are important in order to understand the second half of the 19th century. So we can think in that period like the golden age of Victorian Britain. So it's like the point where Britain and the British Empire achieved his maximum point in terms of geopolitical influence, but also in terms of territorial control. At the same time, railways are very important. So you can see a boom in terms of investment allocation in railroads during this period that is part of the financial and economic dynamism of the period. And at the same time, all that economic growth, all that dynamism is went to improve the standard of living of the population via the increase in wage and consumption. So we have that the purchasing power of the population on average increased during this period. Basically, that help us to understand why we have the development of a theory for consumers. So basically, the quality of and the scope of consumption substantially increasing during this period because on average population have a higher pushing power. With increasing consumption, we will have also an increase in leisure. So one of the benefits of industrialization is that people not only receive a higher wage, but also people receive those higher wage working less hours. So we will experience a reduction in the working hours. So that means more time available for leisure. But one of the important takeaways, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this lecture, is that all those predictions, or the Marxist prediction that with industrialization we will experience an increase in poverty, in terms of the standard of living of the population. So we see that that prophecy has not been fulfilled. So on the contrary, we see an improvement in the standard of living, while that a deterioration in the standard of living. So basically, the marginalist thinkers became important basically because Marx was wrong about his prediction of the evolution in the standard of living. So as I mentioned it, so with the rise in consumption, so we will start to see also the rise and the consolidation of the retail industry. So this is a picture of Harrods that very famous shopping center in London that still exists today and is very famous. So you can visit that in London, and you can see that Harrods inauguration is from the mid 19th century, basically reflecting all that increase in consumption. But it's not just that big shopping center oriented, of course, to luxury goods. It's also shops oriented to a wider population base. So this is a picture of Oxford Street, a very popular street in London, and you can see all those small shops across the street. And basically, what this is reflecting is that there is a lot of consumers, but there is an increase in consumption that is essential to understand this period. Okay, so that was the historical context. So, we mentioned it, an increase in consumption, an improvement in the standard of living population, and in that historical context, we will see the development of a new school of economic thought that scholars call the marginalists, or we will see the development of the marginal revolution. In this marginal revolution, so we will talk about three main characters, but we can also include Leon Walras. I just going to talk about Gibbons, John Bates Clark, and Karl Menger, but we can also include Walras. And I think that what is interesting about the marginal revolution is that it's something that is occurring in Western Europe rather than specifically in Britain. So, of course, William Gibbons will be the most important thinker from the marginal revolution in Britain. But also you have other thinkers in other countries. And basically what this is showing us is that there is a connection between the persistent improvement in the standard of living of the population and the likelihood that those ideas became popular. Okay, the first great the first great thinker or the first important character in the marginalist revolution is this guy, William Gibbons, that basically lived around the mid 19th century. We can see that most of his publication, and the most important one, the theory of political economy, is from the second half of the 19th century, and of course he is highly influenced by all that historical context that we mentioned. So Gibbons is originally from Liverpool. We can think Liverpool like a city that is at the very heart, at the very core of the Industrial Revolution. So Liverpool and Manchester, they are the largest cities in Lancashire, where the textile industry is located. And he can observe that dynamism and how industrialization is transforming not only the production, but also the patterns of consumption. He originally studied chemistry and natural science. He spent a lot of time in Australia, so have that international exposure, that international experience that was very important. But unfortunately, he passed away very young, and that could be a reason why he only developed a theory for consumer. So one of the conclusions that we will reach during this lecture is that Gibbons developed a theory for consumption, and John Bates Clark developed a theory for producers. So basically, in that combination, Marshall basically we combine those two elements, is that we will see the rise and the consolidation of the new classical school. So the most important publication by Gibbons, the theory of political economy, very, very important, and is basically a theory, as I mentioned it before, for consumer. So basically the roots of the theory for consumer that we studied in a standard course of introduction to microeconomics, basically all that thought essentially, or the roots of that came from Gibbons. Gibbons also was heavily influenced by an important philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, so the father of utilitarianism. We can think in Gibbons like the person who connect or who brought those ideas from utilitarianism to economics. Basically, you can connect that philosophical school with that school of economic thought. I mean, utilitarianism with the marginal school. So this is just a picture of the theory of political economy. This is a picture of Jeremy Bentham, very influential in the Gibbons and the marginalist view. And we will see some of the links from that influence in the theory of political economy. So a couple of key ideas from Breton. So basically, Breton is talking about how we should measure utility, or what is the purpose of what is the purpose of life, and basically he defined like the greatest happiness of the greatest number of persons. So basically, this is what gives us a measure of what is right and what is wrong. So basically, we can measure that according to this parameter of happiness for the largest number of people. Bentham also was convinced that the nature is essentially governed by two opposed forces, pain and pleasure. So basically, the target for a policy or a country is to increase for a person is to increase the level of pressure and to minimize the level of pain. We present that, and of course, this is very similar to a problem of maximization of utility. Basically, what we try to do when in a microeconomic model, we maximize utility, so we increase the utility or the benefit if we are talking about a firm, and we minimize the cost that we can associate with pain. So we will see those two elements in Gibbon's idea. Okay, coming back to the theory of political economy, in the in chapter one, so in the first chapter, so we can identify a couple of key ideas in the marginalist view. The first one is the approach, the mathematical approach. So the quantitative approach, we will start with the marginalist, will be Marshall, the one who will develop it, or who will formalize that. But since the very beginnings of the marginalist, so we have a mathematical or a quantitative approach. So basically, the argument for that is that in science, it's not only important to know the duration. So he mentioned, for instance, here, so that we want to determine if something, if an event will happen or not, but also we wanted to determine the intensity. So will be greater or less. So if in order to determine that, so we need to incorporate a quantitative or a mathematical approach. So this is at the very beginning of the theory of political economy. Also, Gibbons will mention the subjective theory of value. So that will contradict the classical approach or that we mentioned it before about how valuable good is, that the classical thought that was related with the quality of work. So for Gibbons and for the marginalists, the measurement of that utility, that benefit, is very particular for each person. After that, in chapter 3, so he will define the main target, the main objective of economics as a discipline. And in that definition, he will place in an important in one important location, or at the core of the economic science, the maximization of utility. So he talked about the maximize the pleasures, and we can obviously connect that with a better idea about the opposed force between pain and pleasure. So the purpose of economics is to maximize pleasure, and a final point that is also very well connected with the definition of the marginalist idea itself is that law that the quantity of utility or the degree of utility decrease with the quantity of a commodity. So this idea of the diminishing marginal return of capital. So in the measure that we increase the consumption of a good, the degree of satisfaction, or degree of utility will decline. So this is because we need to measure the point where I am indifferent between consume a good or not, from that last unit, or that marginal unit. And of course, this where the name marginalist came from. Second, distinguished scholar that we can mention in this lecture about the marginalist is John Base Clark. Base Clark is American, so that geographical difference between Gibbons, who is located in England, and Clark, who is in America, again reinforce this idea that the rise and the consolidation of the marginalist school is associated with that improvement in the standard of living experienced in the second half of the 19th century, not only in England, but also in Western Europe, and of course in North America or in the United States. So in the case of Clark, he spent some time in Europe. So he studied at Heidelberg in Germany under the supervision of Karl Kneis. So Kneis was an important scholar within the German tradition of the German historical school. And we can see that connection between that economic thought more oriented to a redistribution or a higher government intervention in the initial words of Base Clark. You can notice that when you contrast the philosophy of wealth with the distribution of wealth. You can see how Clark evolved from that German tradition toward a tradition more connected with other marginalist scholars. Main contribution of John B. Clark, basically the marginal productivity theory. So Gibbons developed a theory for consumers, Clark developed a theory for producers. And it will be Clark who will propose that idea that still we use in economics, that wages are essentially equal to the marginal productivity of labor. So you can notice how this road is. You contrast that with the Marxist approach about the value of labor. So and you can also, of course, notice the complementarity between Gibbons' work and Clark's work. Distribution of wealth, as I mentioned before, marginal productivity theory. Also, Clark extended that for capital and associate the interest rate with the marginal productivity of capital. And in general terms, so in this second work, he was very in favor of, for instance, financial markets, competitions, and you can notice the difference with his initial work that were more influenced by the German historical school. A final scholar, very important in the development of the marginal school or in the marginal revolution is, of course, Karl Menger. Menger will be naturally more influential in the German-speaking world. Menger is also experiencing that increasing consumption in the standard of living proper from the second half of the 19th century. And his most important work will be this with the principle of economics that have elements that are very similar to the other or to Gibbons according to the subjective theory of value. So in that sense, Menger is also very disruptive from the classicals and the Marxist theory of the value according to the quality of work. But probably the reason, because Menger was it was very influential at the time and was more known, it was because his contrast with the German historical school. So within the German-speaking world, we are having that intellectual debate between Menger, or the Austrian economic school, with the German historical school. So that scholar who was the intellectual opponent of Menger was this guy, Gustav von Schmoller, the most important scholar in the second generation of the German historical school. That debate is known in the German-speaking world like the Methodist strike, or the debate of the method, or the methodology, and it's basically two different approaches. So one, the Austrian one, or the Menger's view, more individual, and the German, or the view of the German historical school that was more collective, or they thought in the relevant unit of analysis, like the country, or like the national economy in general. So Menger had this second publication, The Errors of Historicism in German Economies, that is basically accredited to the thesis, or to the ideas of the German Historical School. Let's talk about the German Historical School for a few minutes before start with Alfred Marshall. So we can summarize the idea of the German Historical School like an alternative to both liberalism and Marxist economy. So basically, the German Historical School will see the national economy of the nation like the relevant unit of analysis, and it will connect the performance of the development of that unit of analysis. That's why industrialization was very important for the German Historical School. And at the same time, it will be very critical of individualism that came from the British tradition. So the German Historical School will go against individualism. Basically, the main critique is that individualism and that approach of subjective theory of value didn't consider the national bonds, or the bonds in a community, and on the contrary, promote the dissolution of those social bonds. We can think also that there is a connection between the German Romanticism with the development of the German Historical School. Actually, that will be part of the critique that Menger will pose against the German Historical School. But an important point, and probably what also connect the historical context with the development of that theory, or that school of economic thought, is the late nation building of Germany. So, as you know, Germany unified during the 19th century, and for that reason, promote nationalistic views, or the idea of the nation at the core of economics analysis. So probably was very important for the consolidation of that unification. So this is just a map that illustrate the different steps in the German unification that started with the Zollverein, the customs union, in the early 19th century, to finally the unification under the German Empire. This is another slide just to summarize the main ideas of the German Historical School. So we can differentiate two generations of scholars. So the old German Historical School, the most important scholar from that first generation was Friedrich List. Friedrich List's most important publication will be this National System of Political Economy. And from the title, you can notice the view. So we are talking about the national. It's not about principle of economics, that is something that is more general and appeal to individuals. So here you have a view, a theory that is appealing to the nation. So national system of political economy basically will be accredited to the classical economies. So they thought that, or at least other scholars of the German historical school, so basically they conclude that that theory is only valid for Britain in a specific period of time. But is not, it cannot be, or those views, those theories cannot be extended to other countries in a different historical period or in a different historical context. So some of the policies of the third generation of the German historical school will be, of course, to promote industrialization. So they thought that industrialization was essential for Germany in order to compete with Britain. And from that view is that you can understand policies like protectionism or high tariff and other restrictions in order to promote national industry and eventually converge with Britain. So within the German historical school, industrialization is the same as economic growth. So basically the way how an economy can grow is essentially via industrialization. You have a second generation that some observers call the new German historical school that will emphasize in other areas, mainly in redistribution, the role of government in that redistribution, and essentially they will develop a theory that we can connect with the social security that of course was seen at the time like an alternative to a revolution. Schmoller is from this second generation and will be again so the one who will maintain the debate with Menger and will be of course the most important economic debate in the second half of the 19th century in the German-speaking countries. Okay, finally, let's review some important elements of Alfred Marshall and the rise of the neoclassical school. So basically, you can think in the neoclassical school like the consolidation or the merge between the classical, the view of the classical theories with the marginalist economics. So the marginal revolution connected with the theory that came from the classical economists. All that merged or putting all that together in one unified theory is what we call the neoclassical school. And of course, the most important person in that process will be Alfred Marshall. This is just a picture of Alfred Marshall. So he is probably the most important economist in the, at least in the English-speaking countries in the second half of the 19th century. Notice that in the early 20th century, he was still very active. And of course, there will be a connection between Marshall and Keynes. You probably we will talk about that next week. And a couple of comments about the historical context where Marshall lived, how that influenced his thought. Marshall lived in the peak of Victorian Britain. So we started this lecture mentioning that at the beginning of the 19th century, it was not very evident the benefits of industrialization. By the mid-19th century, you can think that there were some elements, so basically they started the improvement, but when Marshall was most active in his academic work was at the point of the peak, that is basically the late 19th century. So it was the point of his highest productivity. Marshall was very influenced by the evolutionary theory that again so was that appears and consolidated in the 19th century. So he tried to take some elements from from the evolutionary theory and apply those elements into economics. And also, Marshall saw what we call the labor aristocracy. What is the labor aristocracy? So it's basically that group of workers that benefit the most from industrialization. So basically, workers from mills or workers from manufacturing, from industrial sector, that on average have a higher income or higher wage than workers in other industries, essentially higher than agricultural workers. So basically, it was very evident that the benefits of industrialization um, were were visible for at least that group of the population, and that labor aristocracy have a higher pushing power than other groups of the population, like the peasants or agricultural workers from that were the prevalent form of work in the previous decade. So the industrialization means an increase in the purchasing power, and you have the rise of these groups of the population that we can think like the ancestor of the middle class. So we will see the consolidation of the middle class in the 20th century. But before that, we have a proto-middle class that is this group of labor aristocracy. Marshall also was very critical of Leo Walras' work. So it was not because he was against his conclusion. So Walras is also part of the marginal revolution. But according to Marshall, Walras was too abstract. He, on a certain extent, embraced in a very strict way the mathematical approach, and it was difficult to get the main ideas of the Walrasian or the general equilibrium theory. So one of the reasons why Marshall and neoclassical school succeed and essentially became the mainstream in economics, it was because his theories are relatively easy to explain and relatively easy to present. Even today, when you approach to some heterodox school, sometimes it's very difficult to get the main points. What happened, we contrast that with the neoclassical approach. Basically, one of the benefits or one of the reasons why those ideas transmitted very easy is because they are relatively easy to present. Most influential publication for Alfred Marshall will be this book, Principle of Economics, again from the late 19th century. That is basically, we can see in Principle of Economics like a summary. I like this edition. This is a contemporary edition by Graves Macmillan. And I like the cover of this book because it's essentially a simple one of demand and supply, the theory of the equilibrium point. And the reason because I like that is because I think that it's very illustrative of the Marshall thought. So the main contribution of Marshall will be the formalization of those ideas that already we had the intuition from the marginalists and from the classical economists, but putting all that together, so we have the economic models that we use in a standard course of introduction to macroeconomics. So when you start in your bachelor in economics, so probably the initial lecture will be about those basic models that are relatively easy to explain, easy to get, but are very important for the intuitions and the conclusions that will be present in other topics in the economic analysis. So Marshall will be less abstract than the marginalist, not only in the sense that it was less abstract than the mathematical approach of Walras, but also in the way how explain that. So it's easier to get the intuition or the main points. Again, very important to explain why the neoclassical school succeed. And in Marshall, we developed a key concept that we still use in economics as market equilibrium, ceteris paribus, elasticity, a unified theory for consumer and producer theory, the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, all that was formalized by Alfred Marshall. It will be very in favor of competition, and we will see that he was very influenced by the industrial structure of late 19th century in Britain that will be very present in his description and his thought about economics. This is what I mentioned. So Marshall will be very influenced by that structure and that what we call today the industrial districts. So the industrial districts are those geographical concentrations of industries in one specific location. But what is interesting is, I mean, it's also interesting the economies of scale, the specialization of firms. But what is also interesting is the size of those industries. Basically, an industrial district that was the prevalent industrial structure in the late 19th century in England is composed essentially by small and medium-sized firms. That would be very important because those models usually are based on the assumption that you have perfect competition, that you have no that you have no a monopoly, or a firm have no the power to determine price. We usually assume that firms are price takers, and that could be connected with industrial structure that Marshall is observing in the late 19th century. This is just a map of the different industrial districts that you have in Britain at the time. Of course, the most important one is this one where it is located Manchester and Liverpool. So that you have different cities specialized in textiles. You have other districts, for instance, you have Glasgow here in Scotland. So you have Birmingham in the Midlands. But the most important thing, as I mentioned before, is the scale of those industries. So you have small and medium-sized firms is the core, is the prevalent kind of firm that you have in Britain at that time. Also, another element that promotes competition is that at that point, Britain is very well connected via railroads, and that also promotes competition because you have that labor could easily move from one place into another. So there is less room to introduce restrictions that deviate a market from that idea of perfect competition. This is just a map of Manchester in the late 19th century, as I mentioned before. So Manchester, as other cities in Britain, experienced an important transformation during that period. And you had the agglomeration of those small scales companies, those small scale textile mills that were no very different one from the other, and that also facilitate competition, not just in prices, but also in inputs. I mean, in terms of hiring workers. So if you were working in the textile sector in Britain at that time, and you are not okay with the wage that you are receiving, so you can relatively easy find another job in a similar mill, because you have that agglomeration, but that agglomeration didn't lead to concentration within firms. So you have no large companies, so that facilitated that the operation of those industrial districts that again are closer to what Marshall described in his idea of perfect competition. This is just a picture of a textile mine in Manchester from the late 19th century. I would like to draw your attention to the relatively small scale of that of that mill. So when we talk about industrialization, you may have the idea that we are talking about large corporations, I mean large buildings with 2, 3, 4 floors, plenty of workers. But the kind of industrialization that you actually have in Britain is, again, so we're talking about relatively small and medium-sized firms. Actually, the first large corporation that you will have in Britain will be an American corporation and will be only arrive during the interwar period. That corporation is a Singer Manufacturing Company that started his operation in Glasgow, in Scotland, during the interwar period. And you can see how large, I mean, at least the building of that corporation, how large is in contrast with this small scale firm that was the prevalent firm in those industrial districts. So you can criticize Marshall because, again, his equilibrium is based on this idea of perfect competition. But at the same time, so you need to be aware that that idea of perfect competition is not far away from what is Marshall observing because of the industrial structure of Britain at the time. Let me conclude with the limitations and the contributions of the Marshallian analysis to economics. There are at least 3 limitations that, that you can criticize that actually were incorporated into the neoclassical economic analysis. So one of the advantages that the neoclassical school have in regard other schools is that if an idea is powerful enough, the insights are right, so you can incorporate that into the neoclassical analysis. So they have that flexibility. But in the Marshallian analysis, you have an static rather than a dynamic context. So still you have no theory for technological change, so you have no a theory for economic growth. All those theories will appear in the 20th century. You will have other scholars that propose those ideas and make those contributions. Another limitation of the Marshallian analysis is the lack of a macroeconomic theory. So you will see next week in this course Keynes, and you can see in Keynes as the fight of macroeconomics. Until a certain extent, all the macroeconomic theory is developed after Keynes. So you have not the same the Marshall in the Marshallian analysis. So Marshall didn't talk or write extensively about, for instance, gold standard or what they call standard on other macroeconomic problems at his time. So he basically focused in microeconomics. Again, so his contribution already was very high, but there are some limitations and these some important elements of those limitations would be incorporated into the neoclassical analysis during the 20th century. Finally, we can mention that one of the limitations of the Marshall analysis is that there is no discussion about the impact of power on distribution. So Marshall again is taking the elements of the marginalist school that, for instance, wage is the marginal productivity of labor, but modern labor theory also consider the bargaining power of workers and employers. So there are other elements that we need to consider in order to have a more complete theory that, of course, were not present in the Marshallian analysis. Okay, I think that I have an additional slide about the contribution, but for a reason I don't see that. But okay, let me. Yeah, is that one? I don't know why I cannot see in full screen. Okay, but this is my final slide about the contribution of Marshall. So Marshall made a really large contribution to economics as a discipline, and you can think in Marshall like the one who professionalize the economics as a field. That you have all those quantitative models that we still use in macroeconomics. So you have a systematic macroeconomics theory. And of course, Marshall could be considered like the father of neoclassical economics with that element of flexibility that will incorporate throughout the 20th century other developments into his analysis. And with that slide, I'm going to conclude my lecture, and I will be very happy to get your potential questions. Thank you. Fernando, for a reason, I don't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Ivan. Well, we already have a couple of questions. Let's start with the context of the marginalist revolution. So in previous sessions, we saw that there was a debate around the immediate effects of industrial revolution, and that also explains some negative perceptions by political economists that turn to socialism. What is your take on that, given that here you presented a very positive view about the industrial revolution?
I mean, rather than a positive view, is a matter of timing. So all those critiques are mainly from the analysis of the first half of the 19th century. That is true, that you have a deterioration. So actually, I showed that in the evolution of high. So how you have a deterioration, a decline, because you have that increase in urbanization, in poor sanitation conditions, how the benefits of industrialization didn't immediately went into the improvement in the standard of living. But the marginal revolution occurred in the second half of the 19th century, when you have that improvement in the standard of living. It's known that the observations by scholars of the 19th century that were very important in the development of the socialist idea were completely wrong. It's just that they were observing a different historical period. So the marginalists were observing probably the mid and the second half of the 19th century were very evident the benefits of industrialization.
Good. So now we have a couple of questions regarding Marshall's influence. So Marcus asks, you say that Marshall's theory was static with respect to technological change and even market dynamics. Is this factor lacking in his predecessors? And how did his successors incorporate it?
I mean, yes. I mean, what I mean by dynamic analysis is more like the long run analysis. So there are some dynamic analysis within the Marshallian analysis, within the Marshallian approach, or within the Marshallian models. And basically, when you have, for instance, in a standard introductory macroeconomic model, if you have a division of price, so there is a way how you eventually reduce, for instance, the quantities and you return to the equilibrium. So all that short-run analysis so is already incorporated in Marshall models. What it means is more like the long-run perspective, for instance, like economic law that with that will only have a theory for that in the 20th century with the solo SWOT model. For instance, the impact of institutions. So I mean more the long run dynamic rather than the dynamic within the Marshallian models.
Another question related to that was how different is Marshall's framework to that of Jevons, Clark, or Menger?
I mean, how marginalist influenced Marshall? Is that
Yeah, more
the
or less.
question?
What's the main difference? What's
Yes,
the added value of Marshall compared to the others?
yes, I think that they were very influential. Probably the most influential was Gibbons. So he was, of course, very aware of Gibbons. So he explicitly mentioned that in his work that Gibbons have important insights. So probably what Marshall did is that he formalized some of the ideas that were implicit in Gibbon's work. Something that is important to be aware is the relatively premature death of Gibbons. He actually was working on a second volume of his work. So in the first and the only one that we have is a theory for consumer. So his work, until certain extent, was incomplete. So we don't have a theory of producers. So that theory of producers that we have from the other scholar, from Bates Clark. So until a certain extent, yeah, you can see that Marshall extended, formalized and extended the work of Gibbons.
Elena Ruiz asks, Marshall thought economics was more similar to evolutionary biology than to physics. How did that look concretely? How did he apply these evolutionary concepts to particular economic topics? Also, how does that relate to modern evolutionary economics?
Okay, modern evolutionary economics. I think that modern evolutionary economics is probably more connected with another school of economic thought, the institutionalist school, that was mainly developed in the United States in the 20th century. Veblen, of course, is you can think like the pioneer scholars in the development of the institutionalism is mass is mainly connected with that tradition. What it mentioned about Marshall and evolution is that he was very influenced by the theory of evolution at that time. That was very popular. So yeah, basically he tried to incorporate some elements in the evolutionary behavior in his producer and consumer theory, but that's a different thing from evolutionary economics that is mainly on the institutionalist, or at least in the old institutionalist traditions, because institutionalism have two different versions or two different generations. So you have the old institutionalist school that is that of Veblen, that have his highest development during the interwar period and in the United States. From the neo-institutional that is the more contemporary school that is very important in economic history. You have Douglas North and all those scholars that work on the institutionalists, on the relevance of institutions.
So Fernando now asks, well, he says he's perplexed by the relationship between theory and practice. And as you explained, Marshall is making an intellectual effort to articulate and explain economic phenomena that he was observing. but at the same time, his theory influenced practices of economics and public policy. Could you comment a little bit on this tension between Marshall's theory and the economic applications of it?
Yes, I think that the influence of Marshall is massive. So I mean, even today. So probably um, the only other scholar that had that level of influence was Keynes in macroeconomics. So in macroeconomics, I think that Marshall is still very influential because he provides the main elements for microeconomic analysis, and also because he was like the father of the neoclassical school, and the neoclassical school eventually became the mainstream of economics. Uh, I think that rather than Marshall ideas itself, I think that there is an interesting element in the neoclassical economics, and is that element of flexibility that we mentioned it before, that I mentioned it before, about the Marshallian analysis, in order to incorporate insights or ideas from other school or from other scholar. I think that that ability to reinvent itself, I mean the neoclassical school, is at the core of his survival and his present relevance.
Now we have a couple of questions regarding Leon Balras. And the first is why you didn't mention, well, you did a little bit, but not at the same level that you did for Menger and and Jevons. And then Marcelo asks, why did Alfred Marshall chose to develop partial equilibrium models and set aside Balras' general equilibrium ones?
I mean, they have two different approaches. So Marshall developed what we call a partial equilibrium model. Walras developed what we call the general equilibrium model. It's right that I only marginally mentioned Walras during the lecture. I think that he was part of that marginalist revolution. The thing with there are a couple of things about Walras. I think that we have more time to talk about the marginalists. Of course, I will be more than happy to talk about Walras. But there are two differences between Walras and the other scholars that we mentioned. The first is that the historical context was no, I mean, Walras was located in Switzerland. So you can think in Switzerland like a station of what is going on in Western Europe, but it's different from the particularities that you have in Britain. I mean that relative decline in the standard of living in the early 19th century, the improvement in the second half of the 19th century that made easy to contrast the two periods. And also the mathematical approach of Walras is probably more difficult to get the insights. I see that some designs are similar to the other that we presented. Probably his main contribution is the development of the general equilibrium approach. But yeah, I think that it was just a matter of time. So because in this lecture, so I wanted to emphasize on not only on the marginalists but also on Marshall. So this is why I have no a couple of slides on Walras, but very important scholar also.
Now, Sergio asked, following on last question, why do you think that the Marshallian approach was more rapidly and widely assimilated into economics than the Balrasian approach?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
So why do you think Marshall's approach was more easily adopted in the profession compared to Balras' one?
I think that it is just a matter of practicality. I mean, if you want to understand some concept like, for instance, elasticity, consumer surplus, I mean, you only need a partial equilibrium analysis, so you don't need a general equilibrium model to understand, to get the insights of those specific problems. I think that yeah, Marshall provide a model, a framework that was okay to have a debate to internalize those insights. And I think that was that you have that, so that could be easily adopted in other contexts. I think that again, flexibility and simplicity. I think that they were the key elements in explaining the success of the Marshallian and the classical approach.
One last question says by Pablo, are there any books or bibliography that you could recommend on the history of marginalism?
Sorry,
Any bibliography that you could recommend on the history of marginalism?
I think that yes, because marginalism is not as far away as other school of economic thought. I think that you can easily get the classics. I think that there are a couple of them that are available online. Still, you can, because they are in a situation that is not very different from the 20th century. So it will be relatively familiar. It's not like you are reading the classic, the language, the situation is very very strange for us. Yeah, I think that the direct source, the direct publications is probably a good approach. Jacob is sharing with me an interesting information that there is an interesting book, an interesting reference, The Marginal Revolutionaries by Janet Wasserman, that it could be a contemporary reference.
I don't know, maybe Andre. I don't want to compromise you, but maybe you know more about bibliography here.
There is the edited volume on Carl Menger by Bruce Caldwell, whom we will have in next week or in 2 weeks' time. So if you want to learn more about Menger, that would be a good start. But any good history economic thought textbook covers marginalism as a key episode in the history of economic thought. So you can get more technical approaches or more literary ones.
And with that, I think we can conclude. And I will also kind of tie this together because next presenter will be Keith Rife, which wrote a book which is called Constructing Economic Science, which is not focused really on the key figures on marginalist economics, but focused on basically how we came to understand neoclassical economics as it is today. And he focused on the development at the education level. So next Thursday, you can ask him directly. We will have him to complement today's session. Thank you everybody for attending this class, and see you next Thursday.